Good morning and welcome everyone. This is our fifth webinar hosted by the New York Fed as part of our ongoing culture initiative. These sessions bring together people from all over to share their best practices and diverse perspectives. And the conversations we have had have been really intriguing and informative. And I know this morning's panel will be the same, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm sure that we can all agree that today's topic requires much more time to discuss than what we've got scheduled today. In fact, conversations and planning for returning to our offices in person are things that I've spent virtually, both literally and figuratively, so much of my time on in recent months. And I'll admit, figuring this out is hard. It's new, it's different, it's going to take work to make it work. It's going to take time before we get it completely right as well. And I'm not alone. My peers, leaders of other institutions, we're all trying to find solutions to the same issues. There's still so many open questions. What problems from before times will start to reemerge? Where can we start fresh? And how will a hybrid model, work model change all of this? Now, this new way of working challenges many of the assumptions that we've held throughout our entire lives. There was a time when we thought we could only be successful if we worked 9 to 5 days a week in an office, and doing it all in business attire, no less. But we've learned so much about ourselves and about us as organizations over the last year and a half since the start of the pandemic. Many industries have proved that they can still be effective while working remotely. At the same time, we've seen that some connections are lost when we're apart. We know that so many experiences are enhanced when we're together physically, especially when it comes to bringing in new employees, conducting trainings, or hosting professional development programs. And because I'm also an economist, I'm concerned with what returning to office means not only for our own organizations and the institutions that we serve, but for our local economies as well. They are so dependent on business traffic and hugely affected by this as well. Now, as we move forward in our post-pandemic workplaces, we must be keenly aware of how culture plays a role in all of this. The in-person experience certainly strengthens a sense of culture and connectivity, but can also allow for unwanted norms to become acceptable and in-groups to form. In some ways, remote work has been a great equalizer, especially for working parents, caregivers, and many others. So it's important that we continue to consider ways of working that best incorporate diverse perspectives wherever we're logging in from. Now, one of the challenges that organizations face right now is employees are all over the map when it comes to how they feel about returning to the office. Some are happy to continue to work remotely. Some want to get back to the office immediately, and many want to have the benefits of both. At the Federal Reserve, we're focused on finding ways to preserve much of what we had in place in the pre-pandemic times, while also offering the flexibility that has been so valuable to many people. Now, other companies are taking varying approaches based on the feedback that they receive from their employees and other assessments that they've made. And I'm really interested to see how it plays out for all of us so we can learn from each other. Now, before I hand it over, I'll close by saying that as with everything, it's critical that we continue to speak with our employees to understand what's working well and where we're falling short. Remember, we went from working normally to remote overnight, but the reverse transition will take time. As we experiment, we learn and adapt as needed. It's so important that we get it all right. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Noreen, and thank you all for participating in this event.
Thank you so much, John. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to be part of today's session. As some of you may know, I joined the New York Fed in March. So I was interviewed remotely, onboarded remotely, met all of my colleagues in a remote setting, and have done my best to observe and absorb the culture and norms of this organization through a video camera. Before I joined the New York Fed, I was also at Morgan Stanley, where I was on the West Coast while most of my colleagues were on the East Coast. So I've also had extensive experience living the hybrid work model that we're all talking about now. As John mentioned, a lot of the time that I've spent since I started has been working with him and our leadership team to determine our own approach to the post-pandemic workplace. And this is definitely new territory for all of us. I think the most significant change in workplace norms that I know I've seen in my career. So needless to say, I'm excited to learn from our panelists today, and we have a great deal of expertise assembled. First, I'd like to introduce Amina Elderfield. Amina is a managing director and the head of internal communications at Morgan Stanley. Amina was most recently at JP Morgan Chase, where she was the COO for Global Technology, Strategy, Innovation, and Partnerships team. Previously, she had been at Morgan Stanley before, we just missed each other, for 17 years, most notably serving as the Global Head of Technology Communications. Starting her career in management consulting, Amina has held a number of leadership roles focused on talent, strategy, program management, and communications. She holds her BA and BSBA in management technology from Georgetown University, as well as a master's from the University of Adelaide in South Australia. Next, we have Mark Mortensen. Mark is an associate professor of organizational behavior and a co-director of emerging leaders in a digital age at INSEAD. Prior to joining INSEAD, he was on the faculty of the MIT Sloan School of Management, and before that, at the School of Management at McGill University. He holds a doctorate in management science and engineering from Stanford University, a master's degree from Stanford University, and a bachelor's degree from Colby College, all in computer science. Allison Taylor is the executive director at Ethical Systems and an adjunct professor at the New York University Stern School of Business. She was previously a managing director at the nonprofit business network, Business for Social Responsibility, and a senior managing director at Control Risks. She holds advisory roles at ESG and risk consultancy Walbrook and sustainability nonprofit, the Business for Social Responsibility. Allison received her Bachelor in Arts in Modern History from Balliol College in Oxford, her MA in International Relations from the University of Chicago, and another MA in Organizational Psychology from Columbia University. Suffice to say, we have a lot of degrees between our panelists here today. So let's just jump right into it.
Sure, I'm happy to kick off. Thank you for having us. And it's sad we were two ships passing in the night. The question in some regard really speaks to the fact that many people's lives have fundamentally changed, right? When we think about return to work, the parents should say that, guess what, we had to live through a pandemic where we saw many, many lives lost. We also we sort of had a moment of racial awakening. We also had moments where people were actually meaningfully thinking about their mental health and wellness. So, frankly, from an employee perspective, we see that things have changed for people, right? Sort of just fundamentally, the context in which we live has changed fundamentally. And so I would argue, and I'm sure Allison will speak quite beautifully about this, that what that means is that as companies, we have to acknowledge that and actually welcome and invite some of these conversations into our doors. I would say historically, when I think about, I've run internal comms, historically, when I think about content that performs well for our employees, tended to be, very, very focused on business content, what deals were we doing, what were the big summits that were happening. This last year, we saw the shift. We saw that employees wanted to hear from each other. They wanted to hear from senior leadership. They needed resources, whether it's technical or health related. And so that's going to be in prominent point for companies, that we understand the context in which we live and the context in which we need to engage and interact with each other, but that the company can be a part of that. It isn't sort of incongruent to what employees are feeling at this time.
So I would just add to what Amina said and take us back, if any of us can remember, to 2019. And I think that what was going on there, we had seen a very decisive, at least rhetorical shift away from shareholder value and towards stakeholder capitalism. It was becoming clearer and clearer that our young employees, and let's not forget that at this point, millennials are up to 40, had very, very different expectations of the workplace, are much more values-led, and are looking for employers to take a position on values and social issues in a very, very different way. And then we had also seen an enormous rise in transparency. We had seen already organizations like Starbucks providing mental health support to their workers. So all of that was going on in 2019. And so one of the ways I like to think about the impact of the pandemic is what underlying trends did it accelerate rather than it being a dramatic change of direction. So I think the pandemic obviously highlighted racial justice issues in a way that hadn't happened before. I think there's been a major tipping point in the US around those issues. I think it highlighted social issues and not just environmental issues in questions of corporate responsibility, but it also has been this tipping point in terms of what we need and expect from our workplaces. So it might seem like a dramatic change of direction, but really what I think it primarily did was accelerated underlying trends that were already going on and made it hard for people that maybe didn't believe in those trends to ignore the fact that they were going on.
Mark, actually, let's build on that. How do you think about the short, medium, and long-term impacts of this period of instability and change on organizational culture?
Thanks, Noreen. And I have to start by saying I couldn't agree more with both what Amina and Allison are saying. It really has. It's catalyzed a lot of things that have been going on. It's also changed some of the way in which we've been thinking about things. But one thing that also has been coming up a lot in my conversations with senior leadership and at all levels in different organizations is making sure that we're also calibrating the way in which we're thinking, as you said, sort of in a temporal sense. One of the ways that I often describe or talk about it is you think of it like a medical situation, right? There's immediate triage, and for many of us in the past year and a half, couple of years as we've been dealing with COVID, our focus has been survival mode, right? How do we make sure we've got to get through this? And so for our organizations, it's been heads down, get into the work, and let's just get it done. Now we've then transitioned into, sort of more treatment mode where we've been thinking about, okay, let's start putting in place some of the things that we need for a little bit of a longer stretch. We have to start thinking also about what is the long-term sustainable mode of operating. And one of the things that I want to flag is for many people, again, I've heard a lot of organizations honestly say, you know what, we've done all right. I mean, it's kind of, people feel a little bit almost hesitant to say this, but they say, we've actually come through the pandemic pretty well. And it kind of makes sense, right? If you are hyper-focused on efficiency, and that means cutting back, we all have some projects that we probably could have killed a little while ago, but we let them linger on a little bit too long. That didn't happen. We're cutting the fat. We're getting into what we need to do. No surprise that sometimes the numbers are actually going to look better. The question is, the challenge is, we've been making withdrawals from our bank accounts, individual level, firm level, sort of, and I don't mean financial bank accounts, but energy, focus, everything. We've been making these withdrawals just to make it through. We've been running on overdrive, and there's a real question about how sustainable that is long term. And when we're going to start realizing that the tanks are empty, yep, right? The bank accounts are depleted, and we're going to start going into debt. And that's when we start running into some real problems. So I think one of the things that we need to do is start thinking not just about how we're doing now, but how sustainable is this model and what can we do going forward?
That's a great point. So let me shift gears a little bit. So social context is critical to creating ethical norms. It can also create unethical subcultures. So many on Wall Street have stressed the importance of in-person transmission of norms versus via the apprentice model. A cultural relation is easier and deeper in person, and I can state this experience personally. But the same goes for transmitting negative norms. So how will these different models of work impact this norms transmission? Mark, maybe let's start with you and building on your previous comments.
Sure, happy to. We know, and there's long history of research on this, that we learn from observation. I mean, think for everybody out there in the audience, think about your first job. What did you do? You got in there, you were nervous, you had no idea what you're doing. You hope nobody realized that you had no idea what you were doing. And what do? You look around to the people who've been around, you look around to the people who look wise. I say, look, okay, got Amina and Allison, they look like they know what they're doing. And I watch what they're doing and I copy it. This is how we learn. So this is the way we've learned things naturally since we've been walking upright. The problem is when we're working remotely, we're working through technology, there's a whole lot of loss of fidelity. There are things we don't get. You don't know what's going on outside of what you can see in my background. You don't know my environment. You don't know my context. And there's work, Catherine Crampton's work on the mutual knowledge problem really frames this. And this is, and you know, to Allison's point earlier, it's not brand new. This is work done around 2000, where she pointed out all the things that get lost along the way. So we have to recognize what different modes of communication, different modalities actually lose us. And one of the things that I think is really important to keep in mind, one of the things that falls by the wayside very quickly is tacit knowledge. The stuff that isn't explicitly codified. And sometimes that's because it can't be. Sometimes that's because we just haven't thought to do it. But that knowledge that you just you pick up and somebody says, well, how do you know what to do or what not to do? And especially when we're talking about ethical concerns, some of them are crystal clear, but those are the easy ones. The much more challenging ethical concerns are the ones that are a little hazy, where you say, look, there are different interpretations. That tacit gut sense of this is right, this is wrong, this is what we do here or what we don't, that's hard enough to tell somebody if we're sitting in a room together. And now when you take away all these fidelity, the clues, you take away the ability to see when somebody goes, and you just that quick eye roll, that quick reaction, all of a sudden we're taking away people's ability to learn from their colleagues. And that's a really, really big challenge.
Allison, anything you would add?
I mean, everything that Mark said, I think is so spot on. When you start a new job, we all imagine that you read the code of conduct to figure out how to behave. This is not true. You look at the person at the desk next to you. It's pretty interesting, I think, that both whistleblowing and retaliation have skyrocketed during the pandemic because we feel less loyalty and connection and direct pressure from our colleagues for good or bad. One of my biggest concerns about the impact of the pandemic is that managers who feel less confident in their ability to connect with people and set norms will default to surveillance tools because they don't trust their colleagues, rather than doing the hard work to take to learn what it takes to set and transmit these norms in a remote context. And we have undoubtedly seen the dramatic advance of surveillance technologies during the pandemic because essentially a lot of managers don't trust the people that they're working with. And I think if we're not careful, we will have all the losses of that surveillance technology where employees don't feel trusted, they feel constantly monitored. This does not actually drive ethical behavior. It drives efforts to evade that surveillance technology. And so I really think we need to do the hard work of learning how to lead in a very, very different way and set norms in a different way. I hope this is an opportunity to think about the things that we've just assumed and think about them much more deliberately. But clearly there's another scenario where this goes in a very different direction that I find really concerning.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in-groups and out-groups. So those have always existed in the workplace. Now, while we've been working from home, it's been a double-edged sword. And on one hand, those in-groups and out-groups are less visible. But on the other hand, they're harder to penetrate because you can't see that folks are having the side conversations or who's in whose office. So, what impact do you think this virtual environment has had on inclusiveness and belonging? And how might that change when employees return to the office? Amina, let's start with you on that one.
Sure. I would say here, companies that really are, I'm going to call, really culture driven, did a lot of work during the pandemic, right, in the depths of, teams being at home to affirm the culture. So that's to say, like, I think about our firm, during right in the middle of the pandemic last year, we established a new core value that was implicit, but we called it out explicitly about committing to diversity and inclusion. And what was, I think, powerful about that is it gave us the opportunity for more people to feel a sense of sort of transparent belonging, but also for more people to, literally and figuratively join the conversation. So in some regards, I think the key things during, last year, but also certainly this year will be what are the things that are happening at the top of the house that really make people feel a real powerful sense of belonging, whether it's diversity inclusion and the stories that we see that are told around that are not just sort of words on a page, but really the embodiment of it, whether it is things that we are seeing employees do around sustainability. As Allison said very, very astutely, people really want to demonstrate their values. They want to work really hard. They want to make sure their clients are happy. At the same time, they want to bring that full self to work. So where are we allowing opportunities for people to talk about how they're giving back? You think about across the year. I'm going to take us back a little bit to when we didn't have PPE and we didn't have face coverings, yet we saw regular citizens, everyday citizens trying to create them, buy them, supply them to our hospitals, right? So there has always been this thread, these sort of through lines of opportunities for us to be together, to demonstrate our togetherness, to demonstrate our culture. And I would argue that some organizations, as Mark said earlier, some organizations feel like we actually did a bunch of that during the pandemic and saw that we felt more cohesive, ironically, during crisis. And that's really, in large part, going to be the momentum for many organizations forward.
Mark, anything you would add?
Absolutely. Once again, I agree 100% with what Amina is saying. And this is the good thing about a panel, although it leads to a little bit less debate going back and forth, but she's right. We know in-groups and out-groups are fundamental. They're core psychological things. We've known this for the last 50 years. The challenge is what is triggering those in-groups and out-groups. We now have physical location, and where you're working is another one of those triggers. Now, one of the things we know, one of the strongest determinants of your relationships is propinquity. The propinquity effect, again, long-standing psychological concept. We know that people form friendships, to be really honest, out of convenience. We form friendships with the people who are close. And there's lots and lots of research on this. The point is, the in-groups and out-groups are going to be formed based on the ease of interaction, the frequency of interaction, all of that. So where you sit and when you're in and who you're in with are going to be really important factors. And when it comes to the power dynamics that this starts to introduce, there's even another piece of the puzzle, which is, look, when you're sitting in the office face-to-face or down the hall from your colleagues, you also have better access to resources. You know things, you see things, you pick things up faster and more richly than you would when you're working from home. So now we also have to start thinking about what's the configuration of hybridity, where when people are some are in the office, some are not. When are you in the office? Are you in the office? Amina and Allison and I may all be in the office the same number of days, but if my schedule happens to line up with Allison's better than it lines up with Amina's, I'm going to form closer relationships with her. Now, the challenge is your managers are part of that equation. So managers also have to start thinking about when are people in the office relative to them. That face time matters. It matters for performance reviews. It matters for things like whistleblowing and recognizing when there's malfeasance or somebody who's doing something wrong. All of these factors are coming in. And the challenge is this is introducing a tremendous amount of additional complexity. It's not like managers didn't have a hard enough job as it was. Now you have to layer on top of that, okay, we have to do a big combinatorial math problem to see who's in when and how's that going. But I need one day where everybody's in the office for an all hands meeting. And that's a really tough logistical problem on top of everything else we've had to do already. And so this challenge of in-groups and out-groups, access to resources, all of that is one of the unique new challenges, or at least amplified challenges, sort of leveraging what Allison said earlier, that it may have been there at least in some form in the past, but it's looming a lot larger and a lot more significantly now going forward.
Well, let me build on that, Mark. So specifically this hybrid model, which I think you're getting at, is there going to be a risk of a two-track system for those that are in the office more versus those that are in the office less? And how can organizations guard against that? Particularly, I've read articles and such that it could play out that women are the ones that are at home more. So we could potentially have a DE&I issue on our hands as well. How do we guard against all of this or manage through it?
So, do you want to go? I can go.
Oh, please, Mark.
Okay. I think part of what we have to do is we actually have to start being a little bit more intentional about the way in which this goes on. Now, this is a challenge, and I realize this. Recognize that when we're talking about giving people flexibility and freedom and these sorts of things, part of that is a labor market issue, right? What's becoming one of the new competitive stances? How much flex time are you offering? This is now becoming part of the war for talent, is we have to start saying, well, I offer 3 days a week working from home. But we offer 4 days a week working from home. This is like in Silicon Valley, the competition of who had the better barista in the lobby pulling flat whites. This is becoming part of the currency of why people are choosing their jobs and what they're doing. One of the things we're going to have to start doing in this is start thinking a little more intentionally about the way in which we structure and we give that flexibility, recognizing that autonomy and that choice is itself part of the equation. This is why it gets so hard, right? I need to tell my employees, hey, I'm giving you the choice and some flexibility. That flexibility is important, but I also have to communicate, and here's why I need some of that control myself. I need to make sure we all have, for example, one day that we're all in the office. And so I want to give you flexibility, but understand from my perspective as leadership, I do also need some time from you that is actually aligned. And we have to have more of those conversations with our employees to bring that whole discussion onto the table and onto the surface. Otherwise, it ends up in sort of back channels, and you know what happens when that's the way we sort things out.
Can I just add to that? Because Mark makes a really good point about, and we talked as well as a group about the fact that this whole notion of management, what is management today versus what it was, before, are really two different things. And really the organizations that really focus on the fact that we need to enhance management, that management in some part is really about asking questions and getting under the covers on, one particular person's concerns, challenges, excitements about what's happening now and what's going forward. That's going to be where that sort of new level of dialogue, probably, we used to focus a lot on, direct conversations about clients, and now creeping into the conversation, maybe how someone is truly feeling, maybe conversations about concerns they have of returning to the office, concerns about, as Mark mentioned earlier, we hired a lot of people during this time, could be concerns about, I don't really even know I know how to do the job virtually. I actually have concerns about doing it in person. So that type of dialogue is going to morph, and I would argue enrichen, because it will allow people to be a little bit more transparent and honest. But the key thing is we have to create that environment for people to feel comfortable and confident to do that.
Great. Thank you both. So, and relatedly, so many organizational cultures, and I think you talked to this, have benefited from this boost to this "we're in this together" spirit that was brought on by the pandemics, right? We're going to figure out how to get masks to folks. We're all in this together. Okay, so research has shown that because of this, staff perceptions about employers' concern for their well-being has improved significantly during the pandemic. So what are the effects of this more positive association on behavior and conduct? And even more importantly, how can we sustain it versus going back to the old model, which was, your personal life was your personal life, and you kept that at home, and your business life, when you're here, we're talking about those deals. So, Allison or Amina, maybe we'll start with one of you, whichever one would want to start first on this one.
So I'll have a go. I think, like most things, there is, in this situation, vastly enhanced opportunity and vastly enhanced risk. So we have seen more acknowledgement of each other's humanity. I'm amazed my cat isn't walking across my screen right now. And you see children in the background. People are a little bit less inhibited. And I think that has built a lot of really, really amazing relationships. At the same time, we've seen this complete dissolving of boundaries between the personal and professional. People are working much, much harder. People are finding it much harder to stop at the end of the day and kind of leave their computers. So I think we need to try and build on that recognition of each other's humanity. I love this sort of idea from Mark of being intentional about things that we used to assume, and let's not, in-groups and out-groups were absolutely raging before the pandemic. This is not that they've just kind of come out of nowhere, but now we have the opportunity to be more kind of deliberate and intentional here. And I'd also pick up on something Amina said about how we are thinking about management today. And this also builds on what I was saying earlier about what millennial and Gen Z employees expect from managers. And for a very long time, we've had this idea that good management is about setting direction from the top down and having the right incentives to make the people in your team do what you want them to do. And it's very, very much like that. It is management as control, and it's a very, very top-down view of what good management looks like. I think now management is more about coaching and encouraging and bringing the best out of people. And so again, as accelerated different skills, it maybe slightly reduces the power of things like office politics and increases the power of real competence and who can get the job done rather than just running around the office looking like they're getting the job done. So if we get this wrong, I think we lose a lot of the gains that we've made. Also, unarguable this point that the people that are going to gain most from the remote work environment are people that need flexibility and have family care responsibilities. So remote work is an enormous opportunity to advance inclusion, which we've all realized is a priority. It is also an enormous risk that we're going to make everything far, far worse. So maybe one way to think about it, and I don't know if this is true, is that we'll see an increasing divergence between organizations that are thinking deliberately about culture and direction and inclusion and management skills versus those that are just perpetuating previous problems. So maybe what we see over the long term is that how you set and implement your culture becomes much more explicitly a source of strategic advantage or disadvantage. And just anecdotally, I see from my students, they're doing far more evaluation and due diligence of whether they want to work in a place and what they think about the culture and leadership. And because of increased transparency, we've all got a lot more information to evaluate those issues now. And so what's going on with remote work is just the most obvious way that you can evaluate the culture. But I think that idea of culture as a strategic advantage and the kind of organizational values that align with our personal beliefs is going to become much, much more salient.
And I'll just add a piece on the sort of what's happening programmatically. So whether it is companies are starting to roll out new benefits, so whether it's great, we're going to really take in earnest mental health and wellness and support there, whether it's meditation work, whether it is talking about what the vacation policy is. But from a communications perspective, I think bringing those things to light, so not just waiting for when someone feels, burnt out, they'll call their HR business partner and say, well, how many days do I have off? But really being very vocal about, hey, we're excited that people are, as an example, taking advantage of some of the meditation work or some of the childcare, backup childcare capabilities. I fear that sometimes a lot of companies have these resources, but they're not promoting them. So, sometimes even if you aren't going to use them, the fact that it's there, the fact that you're seeing it, the fact that the organization is messaging that this is important goes a long way in terms of people feeling sort of a part of the equation.
That's great. Thank you. I just wanted to tell the audience that if you have questions for our panel, please put it in the Q&A window, and after we're done with the prepared questions, I will take a look through them and pick some of them out. We've got a lot of great experts here, so feel free to ask your questions into that. Okay, shifting gears, I think somebody earlier mentioned whistleblowing. So whistleblowing has increased significantly during the pandemic. This could signal increased wrongdoing, or as some have posited, it might signal that employees are less willing to overlook bad behaviors in colleagues they're not sitting next to every day. There often seems to be an inverse relationship between ethics and distance. It's easier to defraud someone that you don't know personally or that you can't see. It's also easier to resist pressure to engage in unethical behaviors if you're not all together. So how does this possibility of increased electronic surveillance of remote workers fit in here? What do you think is the underlying trends that we're going to see on this dynamic of whistleblowing and culture, risk-taking culture? So Allison, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Mark as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I keep returning to this point of enormous opportunity and enormous risk. So employees are much more willing to whistleblow on each other during the pandemic. The SEC has seen, I think, a 30% increase in whistleblowing during the pandemic. And one of the reasons for this is that it is extremely hard to speak up, especially when you feel alone. If we think about the famous psychology experiment, the Ash experiment, if everybody before you in the room gives the wrong answer, a high proportion of people will give the wrong answer as well, just because they feel that group pressure. So these social context and these social pressures, they drive ethical behavior. They also create unethical subcultures and mean that we can be institutionalized into corrupt and fraudulent behavior. So it's kind of good or bad, but it shows, I think, above all, the importance of social context. And one of the things that's been a limitation of many of our compliance approaches is that they assume we are all individual autonomous actors. Some of us are bad people and bad apples. If we find and remove the bad apple, we won't have a problem anymore. I think there's a real opportunity here to kind of revisit the questions of group dynamics, of social context, of how we think in groups. There have been lots of amazing books coming out on these topics in the last 6 months. And this has been such an underexplored dimension in academic research for the past couple of decades, that between this and the pandemic, we're starting to understand that our group identities, group dynamics, diversity and inclusion, another issue here, are really, really worthy of study. So I think that's, fascinating in itself. I think hopefully we will see a lot more research on what leads people to speak up. I've just done some work with Novartis, and we did a lot of work on what drives useful speaking up in that organization. And one of the things that we found was that if you just see a huge amount of unethical behavior around you, you're much less likely to speak up than if you see a good ratio of exemplary behavior to unethical behavior. So there's an opportunity here, I think, to promote exemplary behavior, to promote values and behaviors that we reward in a far more deliberate way, and to therefore encourage a culture of speaking up in a way that hasn't been done before. A lot of organizations say that they want speaking up, but when it comes down to it, if you're a manager on a team where there's a big amount of speaking up, you're penalized for that. So we give real mixed messages about what we really think about speaking up. And so there's a new world here, I think, where because we have to think about culture much more deliberately, because we have to study group dynamics, we will get a lot smarter about what it takes to have voice in the organization. You also mentioned surveillance. I'm incredibly concerned about this being used as a substitute for the hard work that we need to do to set norms and social context. It is not a substitute. There's plenty of research saying that it makes employees feel less trusted and disengaged and focus on getting around these controls. It sends a profound signal of distrust that I don't think will be helpful for driving performance in the long term.
What she said, 100% agree. Number one, we have this sort of this crisis of trust that's going on because of working remotely and in these sorts of hybrid environments. And it's the combination of the two, right? Think about what trust is predicated on. Trust is based on predictability. I can guess the way Amina and Allison are going to behave. And based on that, I know what to expect. And when they do what I expect, then okay, then that's what trust really comes from. Now, in an environment where I don't have as much fidelity, I don't have as much data and cues and these sorts of things, I'm flying a little bit blind. I have less data to establish trust. I have less data to maintain trust. And keep in mind, trust has a half-life. It's like radioactive material. You need little booster shots. You need little reminders to say, no, you should still be trusting this person. And within this environment, look, we all know what it's like when you're in the middle of a conversation and suddenly the audio drops out and everyone goes, but those sorts of infractions, those breakdowns, our brain doesn't always treat them the right way. Sometimes we start blaming the other person. It becomes, again, these become signals that erode the trust that we have. What Allison was spot on with is increased monitoring does not fix the problem. In fact, it actually makes it a lot worse very often, because in a sense, you take the burden off of people. You say, look, you don't worry, you don't have to worry about being good. We're going to keep track of that. And we're going to make sure that nobody does anything funky. That sort of, oh, well then look, as long as I'm getting away with it, it's more or less okay. Now, of course, there has to be a balance. But for me, one of the keys here is we have to think about creating that culture. And one of the things that we've been looking at a lot, obviously, psychological safety is a very well used and very important concept. It's increasingly important now as we're working hybrid. And one of the reasons is also it's going into new domains, right? It's been something we've thought about. When we talk about psychological safety, we don't just mean have only nice conversations. We actually mean the opposite. We mean create an environment where I feel comfortable even saying something really harsh and really point blank, because I know it's not going to be used against me at a later point in time. That's true psychological safety. And this is really what we need to work on building into our organizations, and recognize it even spans not just the work conversations, but increasingly as we have to deal with coordinating between, I'm working 2 days from home and 3 in the office. Now there's a piece of the puzzle where I also have to be psychologically safe about telling my management, you know what, I need a couple days from home because of a family issue or something else. Things that otherwise used to be off the table are now starting to become on the table. So we have to work on creating environments that encourage people to be open, to feel like they can be open, free of risk, and not be worried about that. And that's the way we're going to start being able to address and reduce these unethical these breaches. Because as Allison said, we honestly don't know. There's no way we can fully disentangle right now whether it is increased infractions, increased willingness to call people out. This is an empirical question. We will study it. We will find out. Right now, your best course of action is try to put the social structure in place that will allow people to be more open, and therefore to have the discussions that will hopefully cut these things off before they become real infractions.
That's great. Actually, let's talk about managers for a second more specifically. We got a couple of questions on this in the Q&A, right? Before managers, I think Allison said this, here's the work, manage the work, direct it, make sure it's getting done. Now we're asking them to be schedule coordinator and figure out when people are in or out of the office. Understand and be empathetic to the situation of their employees' personal lives, which had been previously off the table. And then, obviously a lot in the diversity, equity, the external environment and how that's affecting their employees as well. So we're now expecting so much more of managers. Do you have any advice for how we help our managers, or advice for managers themselves around how to manage these dynamics and the outcomes for their teams?
Who wants to go first?
I can start. Yeah, why don't I start? So I think, across the company, this is where, you have certain structures in place. Certainly your learning and development organization, it's really going to be, I think, very meaningfully, if they aren't already doing this, they are absolutely, I suspect, rolling out a series of new management courses. This is new competency, right? So everything that you said, Noreen, up to and including, well, how do I think about performance? How do I think about performance, independent of these circumstances, is going to be something that takes real dedication, real focus, and real expectation from the organization to managers, right? So that sort of what I'm expected to do is shifted, and that sort of from the organization on down is important. It's interesting for those people who returned, very early on in the pandemic versus, some people who are sort of still in the process or who may not come back. Getting out of your own echo chamber is important, particularly as a manager. So just really imparting a sense of, I may have my experience, but my experience is as equal as everybody else at the leadership table, and making sure that people understand that. So I mentioned this earlier, I call it being from a place of curiosity and not criticism. So the types of questions that we ask, I find this true of myself as well. So I don't ask, when are you going to come on into the office, but I'll ask the question, what are the considerations that are important for you as you think about returning? it's the same sort of conversation, but I think oftentimes people may just hear it differently. Like, well, I now have an invitation to talk about what's important to me. And we may still land at, I want to see you on Monday, and that'll be a great time, and we'll have the ability to work in person on this big project we're working on. But the how we do it becomes so much more important, I think, in today's environment than it ever has.
If I can jump on and just add one thing, because I think Amina highlighted something. She said the magic word, conversation. And that's, I know people are going to roll their eyes and go, come on, how trite, right? I want policy. I want something concrete. The first and honestly most critical piece is about conversations, is about managers and leaders having an open conversation with their employees to understand. One of the things, as somebody who studied working remotely and virtual work and hybrid work for about the last 20 years, one thing that has never changed, we're remarkably bad at understanding the context of other people, right? We often have a tendency to assume my experience is probably their experience. If I'm feeling okay about coming into the office now, they can be too, it's fine. But we have to recognize that, look, everybody has very different contexts. Maybe somebody, thinking immediately in the COVID context, maybe somebody has a health concern that you're not aware of. Maybe somebody has a family situation that you don't know about. These things can't be solved by an edict from the top that says, this is the way we solve the problem. We have to start by having some conversations. And that means, and harsh as that may be, you've got to block some time. All right. And I know people are like, well, we've got work to do, and this is the stuff we do along the side, right? I've got business. This is the business. You need to stop. You need to block some time to have an open conversation with your people at whatever level you are, to say, look, as Amina said, what are the concerns that you have? That conversation is a critical piece. It's data collection. And then you use that to decide, how do we at our level, in our group, establish what is the norm, what is the norm of how we're going to operate, what are the expectations we have of people, are we still always on, do we give people time, all of this stuff. It has to start with a conversation. And again, I know people go, oh, it's too squishy. So is leadership. Leadership is about the art.
Yeah. It legs directly into your piece about trust. If this is a time where trust sort of can be lost or earned, the conversation is going to be the basis for that.
Mark, what you said really resonates with me. One of the things that John and I have been emphasizing is we can't have a a rule book around this return to work that's set from the top, because so many of the decisions and the situations are personal and depend on the team, depend on the person, depend on the dynamics. And so that decision making has to be at the local, at the small group level, to be able to figure out that plan. So what you said really resonated with me. Thank you. I want to shift gears a bit. So I spent a lot of my career in Silicon Valley. Google, Facebook, they built these great campuses with all these informal interaction spaces, right? We were big on agile. Let's all get together, have coffee, brainstorm, and this is going to be the fount of innovation. Okay, so now we're at either a remote, a hybrid, or just a whole different work environment. What do you think that means for these informal interactions, innovation, the ties that people have to a company? How will that need to change? Mark, I'm going to pick on you.
Okay, I'm happy to be picked on. So again, the informal interactions, as I mentioned before, we form relationships typically based on, honestly, ease. That sounds wrong. We have these highfalutin ideas of, no, I form bonds because of meaningful. No, we form bonds because I'm in front of the person, they talk to me, and I establish some relationships. Now, one of the challenges that we have in this new environment is, again, these things are not determined only by choice. They're determined by some of these structural concerns, et cetera. We need to think sort of more intentionally about what we're using our time in the office for, what we're using time away for. When I'm here working at home, yes, I know, as Allison said, I may have a pet, I've got kids they haven't come in yet, but they could, you never know. So I need to know, what is this time best used for? And when I'm in the office and I'm talking about establishing relationships, right, that's what that is really well utilized for. The time in the office is for, again, transmission of this sort of tacit knowledge, the things that are hard to put your fingers on. It's also on relationship building, and we know that relationships are not only built but also strengthened with ongoing repeated interaction. Also, we know that innovation often comes through random recombination of ideas, right? I'm walking down the hallway, I go to get a glass of water, I happen to bump into Allison and she tells me about a new project, and afterwards I go, that's it, that just solved my problem. So we need to structure some of this stuff in, because these are critical pieces. People often think of these as sort of extras in the organization. This is the grease that makes the organization run. But we as leaders and as employees, and again, it's the conversation piece, need to start thinking intentionally about what we're trying to get out of each piece of the equation. Neither is better or worse, they're different. And we need to start thinking about intentionally, when do we want to leverage one versus the other? And again, it's going to be, to a certain extent, a personal decision with some rules. And the one thing I would remind people is we often forget some of the benefits. I'll give one concrete example. I was speaking to a good friend of mine who's an executive at Total, and he said, you know what we realized? We realized that after every meeting, we go and we grab a coffee together, just down the hallway, we grab a coffee. But he said, what we didn't realize was what that was for. And it was only in the pandemic that we realized that we did two things. One, we all know what it's like when you have a meeting and you get into a knockdown, drag out fight. And I'm sitting there going, Amina, come on, you're just not listening to reason. And Amina's saying, Mark, you're being so stubborn and pig-headed. But after the meeting, when we get the coffee, we sit and we talk, and either we clarify, and I realized Amina was totally right. Sorry, I just didn't hear what you were saying. I was in my whatever. And relationship repair, right? We go out, we have the coffee, we say, yeah, I know I yelled at you, but you know it's not personal. And I said, of course not. We go way back, no problem. We're good. Those sorts of things weren't happening anymore in this hybrid environment, because I ended the meeting, and even worse, I turned off my camera and I was all full of pent-up rage and frustration. What did I do? I walked out. 6 seconds later, I'm in the room with my kids. Not a good combination. We now have to start thinking about, so look, when we're in the office, what do we get? Sometimes we have to remind our employees, don't forget, there's some stuff that you may not remember that you have lost. The relationship repair, the ability to establish, to do shared sense making, these sorts of things. So sometimes we actually have to help out our employees to understand the different pieces of the equation.
Allison, you look like you're, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I want to pick up on this question, and also the question before about management and leadership and what we need now, and say that while there is enormous wisdom from people like Mark who've been studying these issues for years, a lot of the time right now, the challenge that we're having is we don't know what is going to work. We don't know how this is going to pan out. And back to this point that we have this model of leadership that you need to know, and you need to set direction, and people are looking for policies, and people are looking for answers. What I would really like to see, and it would have an enormously positive impact on psychological safety, is managers and leaders being willing to learn in public and say, we do not know how this is going to pan out. Let's have a year of experimentation. Let's try this approach. Let's measure this approach. If it has a negative impact on culture, we'll try a different approach. Be willing to learn in public. Be willing to say we are in a new world where we don't know what is going to work. Here are our priorities. We want to continue to advance inclusion and performance and creativity. Here's what the literature says might work. Let's try it. Someone called Chuck Hawkins in the chat is saying maybe we need to somehow measure serendipity in an on-site versus off-site culture. Great idea. Let's measure our culture. Let's try interventions. Let's see if they work. Let's not rely on consultants and people with the answers. Let's have a year of experimentation.
Well, actually, there's a question in the chat that's a perfect follow-up to this, Allison. So, okay, we planned it out pretty well. We start experimenting. What are going to be the signs that we did it right, that it's working, or what are the signs that it's not? You talked about measurement. what measures would you suggest?
Well, I don't like to plug my organization, but Ethical Systems has a research page with every known approach to measuring your culture out there. You can link to all of them. You can look at all of them. We often have this perception, right, that culture is fluffy. It's impossible to measure. That is not true. There are very, very smart ways using different approaches to measure your culture. There's in general a huge dependency on survey data that has its limitations. But we're starting to see some academics looking at things like Glassdoor and other ways to measure culture. You can look at internal networks. So let's get some rigorous research in place. Let's measure culture. Let's measure culture in particular groups. Let's try particular approaches. Let's have control groups. Let's measure after. Let's see what worked. Let's actually try and advance the science of organizational behavior and culture in this amazing opportunity that we have right now that we're probably not going to have again. Let's not just say, well, we'll put these rules and policies in place and let's not admit it if they're not working, because we've got to be managers and we've got to know the answers. Let's just think about what our employees actually want from managers. And part of this is about psychological safety. And there's really no better expression of confidence than the ability to admit that you don't know. So let's stop mixing up competence with confidence, and let's start admitting that there's quite a lot we don't know about what makes our organizations work and not. And that if for the organizations that can really work on this and get it right, you probably will have a huge source of strategic advantage over the long term.
Here. And if I can add just one thing, absolutely right. And there's so much to choose from in terms of the metrics. Another important piece of the equation, make sure you actually plan for this. And what I mean by that is when you put in place a policy, give it an expiration date. Right? It's a simple thing, but one thing that I've also seen time and time again, we say, look, what we're going to do, we're going to try this out, and then we're going to come back around and reassess. And we don't. It just becomes ingrained, and it's kind of what we do, and and then we forget about that. And that step is critical, right? Exactly as Allison is saying, this is where we're actually going to find something out. So you have an expiration date on milk, put it on your policy, right? The same thing goes for team design. Put an expiration date where you say, look, we're going to run this, and be upfront about it. Let your people know, say, look, we're going to run this for the next 6 months or for the next year, and then we're going to come back, we're going to revisit, and it's all on the table. That is truly also creating a sense of inclusion and involvement in the process. You get people to buy in, to say, okay, look, we're going to try this. Management is showing that they don't think they have all the answers, and I have a voice in maybe giving them feedback to say, yeah, that policy you came up with, it's not working. It's really not working. We need to readjust something. That's a critical piece of the equation. Make sure you do have that in place and own it and stick with it, right? Resist the temptation to say, it actually is working well. Let's just go. Don't do it. Stop. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't cost you much to do that assessment. And you may find that there's some stuff you didn't realize.
I mean, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's incredibly well said.
Thanks. I want to shift back to Allison. You mentioned that the millennials are hitting 40. So let's talk about the generational differences. And I am not a millennial, I will confess. Let's talk about the generational differences and how that affects this. So millennials might be, very comfortable opening and sharing with folks their personal lives versus their professional lives. But through my career, I'd say, there's been boundaries, right? Your work is your work, and your personal problems are your personal problems. So, how do we get, folks of my generation to be more comfortable in creating an environment of, sharing and merging these two, particularly when, our managers are probably in that older generation who are, leading all of this and uncomfortable with these conversations. How do you think about the generational differences?
I think the generational issues are so interesting because many of the fault lines that we're seeing in organizations, and I would certainly say on diversity, equity, and inclusion, young people just, you don't need to make a business case for this stuff. Nobody in my classroom doubts that this is a good priority. This is just not a question for anybody who's a young person. And same issues with values. And so many of the kind of fault lines that we're seeing in organizations are really about intergenerational differences. And we've seen a rise in intergenerational tensions. We're in an era of employee activism that is primarily, but not exclusively, driven by young people really trying to, in a bottom-up way, hold their leaders to account and say, well, the leadership team is all a bunch of middle-aged white men and we want to see something different because that's what our generation looks like. So that's the kind of first thing I would say, is that there's a huge, I think, opportunity for intergenerational learning here. I like the idea of reverse mentoring. I like the idea of helping leaders have more open conversations with young people. Certainly the people in my Stern classrooms very, very often seem to have far more constructive and useful approaches to things like diversity and inclusion than the leaders I talk to, just anecdotally. At the same time, I think the expectation that you can bring your whole self to work, good or bad, and that your organization has to entirely 100% reflect your personal values is maybe not completely realistic. So I think one of the things that we might be able to help people do here, and I think this would support mental health, I think this would support flexibility, I think this would build inclusion, is to try to redraw the boundaries around our working lives and set those expectations. And I don't mean that you shouldn't consult your employees about approaches to things like inclusion and values, but I do think it would be helpful in a lot of cases to say, here's the culture, here are our expectations, here are our values, we listen to you, this is what we stand for, this is what we expect, and your personal life is your personal life. So I am kind of disturbed by this trend, it seems, for employers to be acting in this in loco parentis role, and really kind of we're impinging on people's personal lives in a way that is good in many ways, but I think may have gone too far, and we may need to swing the pendulum here back a little bit. I quite like the idea that I go to the office and I can forget what was happening in the breakfast table and do my job for 8 hours and think in a different way and have a different cognitive load. And I would personally like to keep that going.
Just can I reaffirm just one of the ideas that you talked about? So we had done a pilot within a division about reverse mentoring for that, and it wasn't sort of necessarily just driven by the intergenerational differences, but sort of more junior people with more senior people, so they can really understand kind of what the difference, what the nuances were. And that pilot ran, I'm going to say, for a good few months, and we then wrote about it on our intranet so that everyone could see and hear about this. This was probably one of the most best performing pieces of content for us internally. The level of engagement, the level of likes, the level of shares, the sort of conversation that happened post that conversation really said to, I think, the organization that, hey, we acknowledge that there may be some differences in my set of experiences, but guess what? We can actually still learn from each other. So it's not just about, I want to, those of us who are not in the next generation, there's a lot that we've got to be very adept at in terms of really, attracting and retaining talent, but vice versa is true as well, right? So that reverse mentoring, I think, is an outstanding idea that certainly a lot of us can continue to explore.
Good. Amina, we have a question from you in the chat. So what have you learned about communications from the pandemic period that will continue to be important going forward?
Measurement. So I would say, we talked a lot about, measurement of culture, but we can measure communications as well. So whether it is when we look at, what types of things resonate for people, is it resources? Is it leadership messaging? Is it hearing from each other? Is it something totally different, right? So really keeping track with that. I would also say experimentation. We talked about that earlier. So whether it's you kind of had your intranet or you are, a memo-driven organization, you've got to really think about, one and done doesn't actually work for something that's really, really important. It's got to be surround sound. So it's got to be We put it on the website, we made sure we had some manager talking points, and we actually made it searchable on our intranet site so that people, as and when they wanted the information, they could find it. So I would say that communications has become like exceptionally more important, but it's given us an opportunity to kind of play a little bit more based on employee preferences.
So when you measured things, what worked? Like, what was the most successful? You know, as you think about both methods and content of communication, any advice for the rest of us on what's worked well for you?
Yeah, I would say the I call them sort of employee-driven content. So traditionally, we sort of on our editorial side, we write articles that in the company voice, reflecting whatever a conference, a summit, a big win, awards that we've received, etc. And people, sure, they still read that. It affirms who we are. It affirms sort of our general values. This year in particular, people wanted to see each other. So whether it was we did a whole campaign about Move for Meals, which related to effectively us all, walking around or walking with our kids or, working out on our Pelotons, and that unlocked donations to some of our charity partners. This was like outstandingly well performing, because one of it is you just saw pictures, right? And pictures, obviously, as we know, speak 1,000 words, but it was just deeply connecting. So you could see people from literally around the world doing the exact same thing you were doing. And that there's something very affirming of our culture and affirming of, who we are in our society around that. So that I would say the big pivot for us, and, it's different because, we tend to like our corporate voices, adding that employee driven voice, let them tell stories to each other. That's going to be a thing that really reaffirms the culture.
That's great. Okay, Mark, there's a personal question for you. You're an engineer. How has that impacted how you think about culture and how it could be built and maintained?
Oh, great question. Not just because of the engineering part, but so yeah, I'm a recovering engineer. But what for me is really important is, I know that when I come into the room as an organizational behavior guy, there's a little bit of a soul drop, and a lot of people go, oh, here's the guy, he's going to try to get us to hug and sing Kumbaya and get in touch with our feelings and blah, blah. Culture is a social system, right? It is a system of interdependencies. It's a system of habituated behaviors. And oddly enough, just like you can design a computer system to do something, you can design a culture to do something. The challenge is there's more noise in the system. And so I think that it's very apropos of the situation we're in right now. And I'll just tie in, there was a question, Chuck Hawkins asked a question about there's some employees who thrived and in this culture, and how is there going to be a competition around creating an environment where we're really good at this, and therefore this starts to migrate people? The way that I have been seeing this playing out is, look, organizations are really wrestling with sort of three conversations at once. One conversation is around effectiveness, right? Whatever is the hybridity, the structure that we create, can we deliver? And that's an objective question. Either our numbers are going up or our numbers are going down, we see. But there's a second question, which is around saying exactly as Chuck was raising, look, people, again, it's the barista model, right? Are you offering what people want that is going to attract and retain your talent? And that may be the same kind of structure that allows you to deliver, but it might not. And then the same piece is, or the third piece is around culture, right? The social fabric of the organization. Are we ripping apart the organization in order to allow people to have the flexibility they want, or in order to be able to deliver? But are we actually destroying who we are, the special sauce, the stuff in the ether? So for me, I actually think that a sort of engineering, a hard-nosed approach, right, actually putting some numbers, actually putting some data is the only way that you can start teasing apart what is a complex basically a multi-partite negotiation between trying to optimize on delivering objectives, on ensuring that we actually have the people that we need to deliver those objectives, and on ensuring that we still have the social fabric that's in place. And for me, kind of an engineering mindset, as long as you recognize that there's noise in the system, right? You can, just because you flip a lever, a cultural lever, does not mean everybody will immediately turn in that direction. Annoyingly, your employees have free will. And no matter what you do, when you flip that lever, a couple of them are going to go, no, I'm going this way. But that's, that's a lossy system. It's okay. The engineering model still works. And I think it really helps to put some teeth and some structure behind what can otherwise be a very complex and honestly overwhelming challenge.
Great, thank you. So I just want to ask one final question. What reading, are there additional reading or videos or content that we should all be looking out for to help us manage this very complicated problem? Any advice on resources?
I'm a sucker for a good podcast. I'm like queen. I've become queen of the podcasts. They range from really good ones to just, exceptionally disastrous ones. But really, really, really good ones, I would say, certainly Adam Grant's Work Life podcast, which really gets at the core of a lot of the things that we talked about today. TED Business is great as well. I would also say, so I discovered this guy, Hugh McKay, who's an Australian social scientist, through a podcast called Conversations. But he has this incredible book about, he has a few books, but one in particular is about what makes us tick. And he outlines 10 different motivations for people in life. And what you realize is that we're kind of a little all different. And so if anything, I think it's important to take away from this conversation that there is no one answer here. And there is no one answer for now and for the future. So having the framework to be able to think about things in different ways is the thing that's going to be, I think, exceptionally important as we move forward.
So I'll echo what Amina said. I mean, in terms of go-to things, I'm biased. I'm a big sucker for Amy Edmondson's Fearless Organization. It's a fantastic book, and Amy's just awesome. So that's sort of a no-brainer. But I want to echo what Amina said. I can also say there has been a mass of bandwagon jumpers on when the sort of remote work and hybridity came in. Now, there's a huge range. Some people are coming in and saying, look, I've never thought about this before, but here's my insight. And you go, oh, and it blows your hair back, and it's right on there. There's also, honestly, a lot of garbage. There's a lot of people who are like, hey, I once had a virtual team and nobody died, so I'm an expert. And then they prattle on. My advice to people, I'm not going to pitch one thing in particular, but look broadly, right? Compare, check your sources, see why you should be listening to these people, because there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of garbage out there. Look at why you should be listening to them, and then get multiple opinions. There is one of the things that we have to remember. There's so much in flux, and there's so much that is new right now. As Allison said earlier, nobody has all the answers. We don't know what the right answer is. So talk to a bunch of people, listen to a bunch of sources, get that, and then use that to formulate your sense of what's going on. Also, because you have to contextualize it to your particular organization. Obviously, industry here, we're a little bit more sampled, but you need to think about that.
Great.
So Amina stole my thunder with Adam Grant's work.
Sorry.
I totally recommend him as well. He's an ethical systems collaborator. And I also would echo what Mark said about reading multiple sources. But for me, this is a time to learn about social psychology. It is having a moment. There are more books than I can remember off the top of my head. Jay Van Bavel, my colleague at NYU, has a book coming out in September called The Power of Us, which I think will be a fantastic read. Gillian Tett at the FT has a new book about thinking like an anthropologist. And then the Ethical Systems Collaborator Network has a lot of thinking on these things. And so I think where I would go is the study of the way that people behave in groups. That has been a neglected domain. Now it's having a moment. There's never been a more important time to think about it. And there's lots of wonderful reading, lots of wonderful summer books out there. So it's July. Maybe it's a chance for some people on the line to get stuck into some of those books. But we don't know. Let's have a year of experimentation. That's the main point I would like to make on this webinar.
That's great. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. So here are my takeaways from this. One, I think this is going to be a period of incredible labor market disruption in a way that we haven't seen before, as people reevaluate their own choices, companies reevaluate their cultures and their value proposition to employees. It's going to be, I think, interesting from an economist standpoint to see how it shakes out. A second, in 2 words, intentionality and deliberate. I think Mark used both of those, and that, really resonated with me, that we're going to have to be a lot more thoughtful about our work model than just, 9 to 5 and you're in the office, or, in Amina's case, it might have been, longer hours than that, but, in the office with that daily commute. And so how we really do that, I think, is important. And then the third that really resonated with me is the role of the manager and the importance of the role of the manager in all of this, managing that blurred line between personal, professional, figuring out what works for the team, what works for their employees, I think is critical. I really want to get this group back together in a year, because I think we're all going to learn a ton, and it's going to be a fascinating experiment for all of us. So can we, I'm going to ask Tony, I want to book a reprise of this session. Thank you all very much. This has been incredibly informative. I know for me personally, as we manage through this here at the New York Fed, and I'm sure for all of you on the webcast as well. Thank you to our panelists for taking the time and joining us today.